Hi, everybody. It's Eric Murray from the sugarhuddle.com. Week in and week out, I've been doing these divisional previews heading into the 2018 season as we get closer and closer. This past week on the sugarhuddle.com, I did the AFC North. I did previews for each of the four teams, so make sure you go to the sugarhuddle.com, check that out. Just as a side note, a few weeks from now, we have the season opener, obviously. Thursday night game, it's Eagles against, I think it's the Falcons. So a few days before that, I'll have my playoff predictions. I'll break it down round by round and all that, pick a Super Bowl champion on the sugarhuddle.com, and I'll also have the accompanying video here on YouTube. So that's something to look for down the line. But tonight I'm going to be reviewing the AFC North. Also, the last couple of weeks here coming up, we'll have the NFC South and AFC South to close out all the division previews. So again, keep going to sugarhuddle.com, check all those out, and of course all the videos on YouTube. So make sure you subscribe. But anyways, AFC North. This is supposed to be one of the weakest years that the AFC North has had in a while. On paper, the Browns coming off an 0-16 season. They've lost 50 of their last 54. People expect them to be a lot better, and they did add some things this offseason. But at the same time, I mean, is it going to be, are they only going to win like 3 games? Or are they going to, win 6, 7, 8, even 9 games? And obviously people have pretty varying opinions on that. I'll get to them in a little while. And then the Bengals, you have to think about, Cincinnati. I mean, in one sense, with some of the improvements they made, they could be a 9 or 10 win team. But on the other hand, they could have 3 or 4 wins and actually finish behind the Browns in the division. You never know. Ravens, probably are going to be borderline playoff team again. And then I think the Steelers are going to run away with it. So let me start out top to bottom. Steelers, I think, will go 13-3 for the second year in a row and win the AFC North again. I think this time around, though, they'll be the 1 seed. And again, I'll break down how I think they'll do in the playoffs a few weeks from now. But, with Pittsburgh, one of the big themes that I wrote about in my article is that, Mike Tomlin has been accused of being, quote-unquote cheerleader guy, as Steelers Hall of Fame quarterback Terry Bradshaw refers to him as. And, for anybody kind of confused by that or what the hell is he saying? Basically, what Terry Bradshaw is saying in a nutshell is that, there's the X's and O's coaches, and then there's the more the motivational coaches. And so he's essentially saying that, Mike Tomlin is more of the motivational coach. And that can work really, really well. I mean, we've seen some great college coaches that do that, and we've seen some great NFL coaches that have that style. Think about Pete Carroll in Seattle. But, the problem with that style is that can eventually, wear on teams after a while because sometimes that message gets lost. I mean, the NFL, and you're a head coach, 10 years might as well be 100, and it just gets to a point where, players drown out that message because unlike college where, you're done with them after 3 or 4 years, I mean, NFL, I mean, you could have, a number of core guys that are with you 7, 8+ years. And again, that message can get drowned out. And we're starting to see it in Seattle with Pete, all the things he's been able to do there. But now it looks like they're starting to go backwards. And then Pittsburgh, still winning a lot of games. They have a tremendous roster. And obviously Mike Tomlin, won a Super Bowl the second year back in 2008. Went back to Super Bowl 2 years later in 2010 and almost won it again. But, 8 years since he last got to the Super Bowl, 10 years since he last won it. I mean, for a franchise like Pittsburgh, they have higher standards and expectations than a number of other franchises. And it just feels like he's one of those coaches where he's kind of winning with the talent, but you wonder, in recent years how much of it is really him. So he really has to prove himself quite a bit this year. And we've seen, the Steelers, some people say, do they have an identity crisis because, their history, at least dating back to the 70s when they started, winning championships and everything, is that, hey, play great defense, run the football, blue collar, Steel City, tough as nails, all that stuff. And yeah, I know the NFL's evolved and it's changed in a lot of ways and it's a passing league, but I mean, the Steelers, even with Le'Veon Bell, are such a pass-heavy team. even with Le'Veon Bell's touches, there were times where the running game kind of felt underutilized off and on these last few years. Maybe with a different offensive coordinator, with Todd Haley gone, maybe it'll change. Who knows? But at any rate, it felt like they were coming this pass-heavy team. Defense was starting to become suspect, and last year it felt like they were turning around defensively. And then, of course, the unfortunate Ryan Shazier injury, where he was paralyzed for a little while. Fortunately, he recovered, but it looks like he's never going to play again. Nor should, in my opinion, I don't think he should play again. To be honest with you, even if he could somehow recover, but long road. Even if he could, but I don't think it's going to happen. But at any rate, assuming he never plays again, they started really taking a major step back those last 5-6 games or whatever it was when he went down against Cincinnati. I think that was beginning of December, so maybe it was like 4 or 5 games. So, at any rate, they really took a major step back. You lose Shazier, big loss, and so there's going to be questions about the defense. Can they be a top 5 or 10 unit throughout the season and not part of the season and then fall apart down the stretch? We saw it in the playoff game against Jacksonville. I mean, Steelers' offense did plenty of good things, scored plenty of points, and Jacksonville was still able to outscore them in a shootout. I think it was 45-42 at Pittsburgh. Second time Jacksonville beat them at Pittsburgh last year. So, I think it's just one of those deals that we have to see. But, starting off firstly with the offense, Ben Roethlisberger, he's 35, 36, somewhere around there now, and he's definitely showing signs of wear. There were times last season where he looked like he was done, and there were other times where he still looked like a Pro Bowl caliber quarterback. Can't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but he still had a pretty good statistical season. And actually, I believe he had 14 interceptions, but remember, 5 of those came in that early season home game against Jaguars, a terrible game. That was, I think, right after the game is when he made those comments that maybe I don't have it anymore, and he's kind of teased that maybe he's going to retire soon. He's starting to get kind of in that Brett Favre diva mode, and that's definitely kind of troubling for Steelers fans, but you kind of have to tolerate it because he's still a great player, and I don't really believe in Mason Rudolph, who they drafted in the 3rd round out of Oklahoma State. I don't think he's any good, and again, I don't take the preseason too seriously, but through a couple of preseason games, and again, just a rookie quarterback, but through a couple of preseason games, it looks like he's got a long way to go. That he's more Landry Jones than Ben Roethlisberger. So, don't really have a whole lot of quarterback depth, so you definitely got to hope that Ben does stay around, even if you have to put up with some of his antics, with some of the unnecessary drama and some of the diva attitude. But he's still a heck of a quarterback, and outside of that game, the rest of the season, 9 interceptions, so not too shabby, really just one bad game, and generally played pretty well for the most part beyond that. I expect if he stays healthy, which is obviously big if, because he could miss 2 or 3 games, but if he stays healthy, he'll continue to play exceptionally well. I mean, teams still can't figure out how to cover Antonio Brown, even when they double and even triple cover him. I think he's the best receiver in the NFL, although I would say Julio Jones is certainly right there. Odell, you have to give him some love too, but I'd like to kind of see him do more in the postseason. He only got that one opportunity so far, so only time will tell on him, but certainly a number of talented receivers at the top of the league, but I think Brown's the best, and having him, Juju Smith-Schuster had a really great rookie year. He had, I think, 58 catches, 917 yards. I can't remember the exact touchdown total. I think it was between 6 and 8. But he was a really dynamic player, and now he's going to be basically the starter next to Brown, and he's already done some terrific things in the first couple preseason games. He has a touchdown in both games, I believe. Tight end-wise, a little more questionable. Jesse James has been kind of mediocre, and it looks like Vance McDonald, who they had traded for from San Francisco prior to last season, or I think it might have been the beginning of last season. But anyways, both guys are serviceable. Neither one's kind of the long-term answer, so there's going to be some questions at tight end, and that could be a concern. But if those guys do a decent enough job blocking, if they can each get like 30 or so catches apiece, I guess that'll do. But they've got some really good receiver depth. There's a kid, Damon Patterson, that came from my alma mater. I'll give him a shout out to Youngstown State, undrafted free agent. He's looked pretty good in preseason. He's a guy who could climb his way up the depth chart. And then, of course, James Washington, Mason Rudolph's teammate at Oklahoma State, was drafted in the second round, and Rudolph was drafted, obviously, in the third round. James Washington, I'm not real, like Rudolph, I'm not real high on him. He has a running back build. He's like 5'10", 5'11", 215. So he has kind of a weird build. He's not really a twitchy athlete. He's a guy that it takes him, he can, once he gets full go off the line of scrimmage, he can blow by guys and get open, and he has really good hands. But he's a guy that has to build up that speed. So he's a guy I imagine that a lot of teams are going to try to jam. But I still think he could be a really good guy in the slot. And I think especially what I would look for with him is on third and longs, and we know that the Steelers and Ben like to play out of the shotgun a lot when they have those third and long passing situations, even beyond third and long, but especially third and long. And so don't be surprised if James Washington is kind of put in the slot on some of those third and long situations. And basically, if teams are playing zone and play off of him, he could get wide open and make some nice 10 and 15-yard key first down catches. So that could be key. But, overall, you've got, pretty darn. You have arguably the best receiving core in football. Justin Hunter, I don't even know if he'll make the team. He barely even played last year for the Steelers, and he hasn't had, he's been a total disappointment in the NFL. Hayward Bay has been a really good special teams guy and makes some catches here and there. We'll see if he kind of comes back as like a fourth receiver. And then running back, of course, Le'Veon Bell looks like he's officially going to sign right before the season starts. Same thing he did last year. Obviously, we know about the whole franchise tag, contract situation thing. But, I expect the Steelers this time around, they pretty much know for sure that he's, gone for good after this year. They're not going to try to franchise him a third time in a row. I just don't see it. Three is the max, but I just don't see him trying a third time. And so I expect he'll get 350 to 400 plus touches like the last couple of years. And I think that's what the Steelers want to do, run him into the ground. Makes a lot of sense. So you'll get a heavy dose of Le'Veon Bell, but I think with Ben being another year older and seeing some of the flaws in his game last year, I think you really need to balance out the offense a little bit more, and I do expect that, especially from a running game standpoint. Bell has a lot of catches out of the backfield too, but I think especially carrying the ball, you're going to get a heavy dose of Bell. And then James Conner, the former Pitt Panther, this is his second year now, and he's been getting a lot of work in the preseason, obviously. He's looked pretty good. I expect he's going to get, even with Bell, and them trying to kind of run him into the ground, I do expect James Conner to get more touches, so I think James Conner could also make a little bit of an impact off the bench. So, the skill positions are loaded. One concern I have is the offensive line, because when healthy, they have one of the better lines in the league. Villanueva, David DeCastro, Marquise Pouncey, they were all, Pro Bowlers last year, but there were some games missed due to injury, and especially at some of their other positions. So, and you lost Chris Hubbard. He signed a big contract with the Browns, and he's going to be the Browns' starting right tackle. So, depth is a little bit of a concern, but again, you could say that, really across the league. So I guess I wouldn't be overly concerned. But some offensive line injuries could be a bigger concern than they've been in the past for Ben Roethlisberger, just because, again, a year older, and he could slip a little bit, and so he might not be able to elude some of those sacks as much. We'll see. And then defensively, that's kind of the big concern, because, again, this unit, once they lost Ryan Shazier, it was kind of like, Dallas, without Sean Lee. They're just a totally different defense in a bad way. They're just terrible losing that one key guy. Shazier is such a great leader, and like a Sean Lee, also made a lot of plays from his linebacker spot, got everybody lined up. And you saw the Steelers really take a big step back. I want to say the first three games after that Cincinnati injury, once Shazier went down, I want to say the first three games they gave up like 30 points combined. 90 points combined. Maybe I'm thinking of the Ravens. Anyways, the Steelers gave up a whole lot of points, down the stretch the rest of the way. They gave up, several 20-plus point games, 25, 30-plus point games, and then obviously the playoff loss against Jaguars giving up 45. But Just didn't look the same. Problem is, you look at their inside linebacking core now without Shazier. And Vince Williams, he's a decent player. He's going to be back. He's the second year as a full-on starter. But, you got John Bostic and Tyler Matakevich. And Matakevich, former Temple Owl, he's a guy who's one of the better linebackers in college football. But he's a guy that, I think he ended up going in the 7th round. Doesn't really have the size, doesn't have the athleticism. He's kind of like that old school linebacker, which doesn't translate to today's NFL. And already he's had some preseason struggles, and the same with John Bostic. He's a journeyman guy. He had played in Chicago, and he's a guy who's missed a ton of games due to injury and wildly inconsistent, and they gave him a 1-year deal. And I believe he missed a couple of tackles against the Eagles in the preseason opener. So you can't really feel that great about your inside linebacker situation and your depth there. Outside linebacker-wise, T.J. Watt had that terrific rookie year, and I expect him to get better and better and better, definitely living up to the family name. But at the same time, the other side of it, Bud Dupree is actually ranked as one of the worst pass rushers in the NFL since he came in the league a few years back. And I believe, if I'm not mistaken, this is his 4th year, so it's the final year's contract. They didn't pick up his 5th-year rookie option, obviously. So it's looking kind of like another Jarvis Jones situation. That's definitely kind of a scary thing if you're the Steelers. So, if your pass rush, as far as your sack production, drops off, on top of the fact that you have some issues at inside linebacker, that could really be a mess for your defense. So, it's going to be interesting. And that's why it's kind of interesting, when you think about drafting Edmonds, because he comes out of Virginia Tech, and he's like a strong safety, but he's like an in-box kind of guy who can also be a linebacker for you. And it's going to be interesting to see if he's going to be used kind of like we're seeing a lot of these safeties that are kind of almost turned into linebackers now, like Adeo Buchanan for the Arizona Cardinals, where, he's still technically a strong safety, but he's also going to get a lot of snaps as an inside and possibly even an outside linebacker. Certain situations, he can do a little bit of everything for you, and so maybe that'll kind of compensate a little bit, for Shazier's situation. You're trying to replace him. D-line wise, you still got Cam Hayward, Stephon Tuitt, you got Hargraves there. So, good looking D-line. But then again, linebacking core outside of Watt, anybody's guess. Secondary, though, really impressed me because Mike Mitchell, he's a guy in the box type of safety. Couldn't, cover a wet blanket, basically. They move on from him, and then they go out and they get Morgan Burnett, the former Packer, and it's like 3 years, $14.5 million. I mean, that's a steal of a deal, and the safety market's down, so that's part of the reason why they could do that. But nonetheless, I mean, I thought that was a big pickup. Obviously you got Joe Hayden back, and then Sean Davis. You're going to have him. You're going to have Artie Burns. So, you look at it, and they have some good pieces on defense, but depth is still an issue. And again, if your sack production goes down, then all of a sudden it puts more pressure on the secondary. If your inside linebackers, if they're missing some tackles, that could be the difference between being, maybe the 5th or 7th ranked run defense to being like the 20th or 25th ranked run defense. If some of those running backs are able to get to that second level and those linebackers aren't able to make plays, that's a killer. So Steelers, I still think nonetheless, 13-3, win the AFC North. I just think that, looking at the rest of the division, they have Baltimore's number. They have Cincy's number. They have Cleveland's number, even though Cleveland's certainly played them pretty tough based on their lack of success. But I just think they'll run away with the division. They'll pretty much go 6-0 in the division or 5-1 at worst. And the AFC is just wide open, let's face it. So I feel pretty good about the Steelers repeating last year's success. I just think, especially the way the NFL rules keep changing the way they have, I just think that it's favoring offense more and more, obviously. Doesn't take a rocket scientist to see that. So I think that'll kind of help the defense as well, the Steeler defense as well, because they know that, the NFL's kind of screwing defenses on a lot of these penalties anyways, like we've seen already in preseason, a lot of terrible calls and some experiments, and we'll see how that carries over into the regular season. So I think the Steelers, even though it's not a formula to winning championships in the NFL more often than not. I think the Steelers are going to probably outscore a lot of people. And I do think that, even though we'll still see some issues at inside linebacker, I do think they're going to have enough pieces around the rest of the defense that I think maybe that'll make up for that. And they'll see what they do in the playoffs. I mean, in the playoffs, that's really when you can't outscore people. I mean, outside, obviously, it happened to them against the Jaguars last year, but nonetheless, you can't do that week in and week out postseason. So it's going to be interesting. I think the last team that really was able to outscore people in the playoffs pretty much week in and week out that got to a Super Bowl was the Cardinals in 2008. And, of course, they ironically lost to the Steelers. 35 seconds left, Ben to Santonio Holmes, but they almost won that game. So, maybe it'll work for the Steelers, but, I mean, with that passing game, those receivers, Le'Veon Bell, he's going to be motivated to continue to play at a high level. Like I said, maybe John Connor will contribute. And then if the offensive line, if they're available the whole season, I think collectively the starters missed like 16 games. So I think if they can pretty much hold up top to bottom, then losing Chris Hubbard is not going to be that big of a deal. So we'll see. But that's how I feel about the Steelers. So I think they're still going to have a terrific year. And then Baltimore, I've also got them repeating last year's result, 9-7 and second in the AFC North. But here's where I think it changes. Last year, they were 9-6, Week 17 finale, hosting the Bengals. They blew it, and then they finished 9-7. They didn't have the tiebreakers, so instead of being like the fifth seed in the AFC, they lose that game, and they end up missing the playoffs. I think this year they'll actually have the tiebreakers that'll get them into the playoffs. So I think they will be a wild card team this year. And then again, my playoff preview coming up in a few weeks. We'll see how Baltimore does in that according to my predictions. But Baltimore, it's interesting because they're kind of, they're trying to forget what happened at the end of last year. The Dalton to Tyler Boyd 49-yard touchdown. Really a game that Cincinnati had controlled throughout. Baltimore took the lead mid-fourth quarter, and then Cincinnati, fourth and long, had that 49-yard touchdown pass. Baltimore just completely blew it. I mean, the whole city just had to have been losing their minds because Baltimore was, like the hottest team in football going into that game. They had won like 5 of 6. The only loss was the Steelers in Pittsburgh. It was 39-38, and they still almost won that game, back and forth shootout. And I thought they had a legit chance if they would have made the playoffs of actually going into Foxborough, possibly in like the divisional playoffs, and beating the Patriots, and then getting to at least the AFC Championship. And we'll see what would have happened. Obviously, that didn't end up happening, but it's like a new era in Baltimore because Ozzie Newsome, who's been the GM since they moved to Baltimore in '96, of course, was with the previous franchise that was the Ravens, which of course was the old Cleveland Browns, Hall of Fame tight end, great career, and been just as great of a GM. He announced this offseason that he's going to retire after this 2018 season. Eric DeCosta, who's been working under him, I believe, since 2012 as his assistant GM, he's going to take over. And Baltimore just had a terrific draft. They had definitely one of the best drafts out there. And Ozzie, he traded down twice in the first round. Initially, they had like the 16th pick. Some people thought maybe they'd take a quarterback there. Then they end up, on Hayden Hurst, the former South Carolina tight end. He's a guy that a lot of people are really, really high on. And then, you pull the trigger on Lamar Jackson. I'm not a big Lamar Jackson guy, to be honest with you, but nonetheless, I mean, it's interesting. It'll be an interesting experiment to see how that works. So far, he struggled a lot in the preseason. So, don't really expect him to get on the field this year unless the Ravens are really bad. Maybe he starts at the end of the year just for the hell of it. But nonetheless, we'll see what happens long term. But definitely, Ozzie, his last draft, I mean, he's really got some onions. I mean, he really had a pretty ballsy last draft. I mean, he laid it all out on the line, knowing that it was his last. And then, of course, you think about Mark Andrews, the Oklahoma tight end. A lot of people thought that maybe he was the best tight end in this year's draft. He goes in the third round. So, Baltimore did some really, really terrific things in the draft. There are a number of other guys as well, but those are just a few guys. And, you think about like the tight end position, for instance. It's really been a long time since they've solidified that position. Max Williams, who they took out of Minnesota a few years ago, second round pick, it's been a total bust. Nick Boyle, he's like an H back, sort of a blocking tight end. He can catch some passes here and there, but he's really not your true number one guy. So now all of a sudden you're talking about Hayden Hurst and Mark Andrews. All of a sudden, you could have a pretty loaded situation. And yeah, I know, Joe Flacco's never been that great of a quarterback, and he's only worsened. But, now you're talking about a team where the running game continues to get stronger. Alex Collins really had a breakout year last year. You're going to have Dixon. Kenneth Dixon's going to be back after the injury last year. So, having him back, and if he can kind of live up to his potential that a lot of people thought he had coming out of college, maybe he'd be like the next Ray Rice on the field, obviously. So between him and Collins, you got to have a strong tandem there. So the Baltimore running game, which ended up, I think, finishing top 10 in the league last year, they have a chance to repeat that. Still have a good-looking offensive line led by Ronnie Stanley. You got James Hurst back, so you got your tackles back. But I think with those tight ends, they'll do a lot for Flacco. And I actually do think Flacco, between those tight ends, the way the running game's been, and then the big thing is Ozzie especially got really aggressive with receivers. He got, I think it was, Jordan Lasley from UCLA, and you got the kid from, I think it was New Mexico. His name's escaping me. It's like I think it's Jaleel Scott. Yeah, he's like 6'5", 215. But he got those guys in the draft. But more importantly, the offseason leading up to the draft, he has John Brown, the former Arizona Cardinal slot receiver, the speedster, and, of course, Michael Crabtree, who actually played against them in the Super Bowl in 2012 and almost had a game-winning touchdown. They get him from the Raiders, both of those guys in free agency. They got him on the same day. I think it was March 16th. And then right before the draft, April 27th, they get Willie Snead from the Saints, who was lingering, and people were like, is he going to get a job? He still has some upside. So you get those three guys, and all of a sudden it's like Brashad Perriman, first-round bust. Who cares, because you have these guys to replace him. So you have a much, much better receiving corps, much, much better tight ends. If your running game can pretty much, capitalize on last year's success. Of course, you have Marty Mornhinweg as your offensive coordinator, and he's a tremendous coordinator. Last year, all things considered, did a good job. And I think even in a West Coast offense, I think because of some of these weapons now, I think even in a West Coast system, I think he will try to let Joe try to kind of sling it downfield more and get more vertical. Because remember, Flacco, cannon for an arm, the early years of his NFL career, even though his numbers weren't any better than they are now, he was throwing a lot of deep balls, and it was leading to wins, especially in the playoffs. That playoff win against Denver in 2012, and then they end up going on to win the Super Bowl. He had 11 touchdowns, no picks that postseason in 4 games was pretty unbelievable. But getting to my point, I think this Baltimore offense is going to be very, very aggressive in the passing game. I think they're going to be much improved. If Flacco holds up the whole 16 games, I think he's going to have one of the most productive years of his career. I believe his career high for touchdown passes is 27. He could get to that, especially with the way these NFL rules are like I said, are changing, going against the defense. I'm going to say probably 22 to 25, and that would be like around his second highest total for his career. 22 to 25, and I think the yardage will be a lot higher. He only had like 3,100 and something yards. It was a really low amount. And he did miss, I think it was 2 or 3 games. Nonetheless, he's barely averaging 200 yards a game. So I think that will go up, and I think he'll have a shot at like a 4,000 yard or so season, which isn't like impossible, 250 yards a game in this day and age. But I think Flacco's going to turn it around for this season. He kind of has more to prove now that they've drafted Lamar Jackson. Baltimore's proved their point. Now Flacco has to kind of prove his point and show that he is passionate about the game still, that he does want to go out there and be a winner, because some people are wondering, has he lost his passion, lost his drive the last few years? So, yeah, like a lot of people, I'm not a big Flacco guy at all. He's not that great of a quarterback, but part of it is he's got no weapons, and he's been just dinking and dunking so much, like he's Alex Smith the last 4 or 5 years. So I think they're going to get more aggressive with the offense this year. The running game should continue to do well. And I think Baltimore is going to have a pretty impressive year offensively, especially with those weapons, and they could definitely make a deep playoff run. So they're a dangerous team, much more dangerous than even last year when people thought they were dangerous at the end of the year, like myself. And then defensively, they're getting back to those Ray Lewis, Ed Reed days. I mean, when they won the Super Bowl in 2000, 2012, despite Flacco's postseason in 2012, it was still all about that Raven defense. In the last few years, it just hasn't been the same. Lewis retired after they won the Super Bowl. There was other guys that left, and the other guys got older. Obviously, Ed Reed, they ended up moving on from him, and then he eventually retired soon after. But last year, they had a big comeback year, struggled against the run, but they were, they had a really strong pass rush, great secondary, a lot of takeaways. I think they're going to continue to take that next step and continue to be great again. I mean, C.J. Mosley is as good as any inside linebacker in the NFL. Terrell Suggs went back to the Pro Bowl last year. It's his first time since, I think, 2013. He doesn't care that he's 35 plus years old. I mean, he's still playing like a young man. He's still determined. He wants to try to get another ring, and I think he'll do some good things. Matt Judon is going to be the other rush linebacker opposite him, and Judon's a former Grand Valley State kid. He's been in the league a couple years now, and he's a guy who did really nice job off the bench last year. Also started a number of games, so I think he's going to continue to prove. They're really high on him in Baltimore. The other inside linebacker, I can't really pronounce his name real good. It's Patrick Onwuakor. I don't know. I can't pronounce it really good, but it might be Onwuakor. But at any rate, whatever the hell his name is, they actually drafted Kenny Young out of UCLA, another pick that a lot of people really liked. They took him in the mid-rounds, and he's actually going to push Patrick O, we'll call him, for that other starting inside linebacker job. But, Patrick still did pretty decent last year. So it's not like a dire thing if they can't upgrade from him right away, if Kenny Young's not ready to take that job. But looks like you should have pretty good linebacker depth. Defense line is going to be the big concern because, you got Brandon Williams and you got a couple of these other guys, and, there's been a lot of injuries, a lot of inconsistent play. Depth is thin, and again, you've struggled to stop the run. So I think that's going to be the main thing. If a lot of those guys are able to hold up across that defensive line, I think their run game will improve enough that they'll have a top 5 unit in this league. And if it doesn't, then they might have a top 10 or 12 unit, which would be a little bit of a setback. So I think for them to have a chance to make a run at this division, and especially in the playoffs to really make a run, their run defense certainly has to tighten up. But I do think at the end of the day, they'll make enough improvement. I think they'll stay healthy enough, do some things there. The pass rush will continue to look good. And then that secondary, Brandon Carr, everybody thought he was done after his Dallas years, and he really revived his career last year. Marlon Humphrey had a really nice rookie year. Eric Weddle, Pro Bowler. Tony Jefferson didn't go to the Pro Bowl, but I believe it was the first year of his 4-year contract. He signed a 4-year, $34 million contract. He had a pretty decent year as well. So overall, I mean, it's still a terrific-looking secondary, pretty darn good linebacking core. Defensive line, I think, again, if they stay healthy, I think they'll show enough improvement. So Baltimore's going to be a scary team, but despite all the improvements they made, I don't know if it's all going to come together right away in the regular season, and so that's why I'm going to have them go 9-7 for a second year in a row. But they're going to be a much more improved, much more impressive 9-7. And like I said, this time around, they're actually going to make the playoffs this time around. They'll have the tiebreakers. Cincinnati, I have them third in the division, and again, they could easily finish behind Cleveland. Last year, they actually finished 7-9, despite all their problems. I actually have them going 6-10 this year, and their team, much like Baltimore, great draft, much improved. But you just wonder. I mean, Marvin Lewis. Some people say he's a really good coach in a really bad situation. I can see that, but you also wonder, again, has the message been lost? Because I mean, this is a guy, I think 2003 was his first year, and so you're talking about year 16, and you just wonder. I mean, do a lot of these guys in the locker room, a lot of them have been around him a long time, do they still believe in him? Because really, it feels like the only reason why he kept his job is because they beat Baltimore Week 17. And the guys did play hard for him, and they do think very highly of him, but is he really the guy? And then Andy Dalton, a lot of his woes last year and really last couple of years is playing behind arguably the worst offensive line in football. Getting sacked a lot, having a run game that finished 31st, and for a good chunk of the year was the worst rushing offense in the league. So, having that offensive line, no running game, it seems like Andy Dalton should get a lot better this year. And Bill Lazor, who's going to be his offensive coordinator all year long and not just like the final 3 quarters of the season like last year, that definitely helps. Lazor did a nice job last year, big upgrade from Ken Zampese. But at the same time, they traded for Cordy Glenn, the former Bills left tackle, in the offseason. Really, really nice trade. They got good value out of that trade. But, Cordy Glenn's a guy who missed, I think he ended up missing 10 games last year. And he's missed a number of games the last 2 years after rarely missing a game like his first, I think, 4 seasons. So you don't know what you're going to get with his health there. Billy Price, the center, they drafted in the first round out of Ohio State, another Youngstown area guy, just for the hell of it, want to throw that out there. But great college center, 4-year starter. He's a guy, though, remember he had that pectoral injury at the combine, and he's perfectly fine now, but it does concern me, an injury like that, could he re-aggravate it? So even though the offensive line has definitely gotten a lot better this offseason, I'm still concerned that if Cordy Glenn, keeps dealing with the injuries he has the last couple of years, and if Billy Price re-aggravates, his injury, the pectoral, then all of a sudden your offensive line's thin, and all of a sudden you're terrible running the football again. All of a sudden you can't protect Andy Dalton. So I'm a little bit skeptical about the health there. We know Cincinnati struggles winning a lot of big games. And, Baltimore is going to be ticked off for what happened last year, and they're going to come out and play them hard. Cleveland, it's going to be tough to beat them twice, and then they never beat Pittsburgh. So those 6 divisional games, they could have a lousy record, and then that could really screw them up for the rest of the season. So I'm just not sure. Marvin Lewis, another year on the hot seat. Andy Dalton, another year on the hot seat. I think they should have tried to go with McCarron and give him a year. McCarron getting injured with the Bills, kind of a moot point now, but I'm just not real sold on Cincinnati. They had really, really good draft, but I'm thinking that that'll benefit them more down the line in 2019 and beyond. Because of the offensive line, the health there, Joe Mixon can definitely have a dominant year. He can have 1,200 plus yards pretty easily, but if Glenn doesn't hold up, if something happens to Price, all of a sudden your line's not any good. And then defensively, they're a little bit thin at linebacker. They got Nick Vigil back. Vincent Ray just got injured earlier in training camp and should be back for the start of the season. He's a backup linebacker, but borderline starter, and he provides a lot of depth, so not having him there definitely hurts. Defense line-wise, they have a lot of talent there. Obviously, Geno Atkins has been really great. Michael Johnson's, I mentioned in my previous video, he's probably going to get cut. But, when you got Carl Lawson, when you got Jordan Willis, and then, of course, Sam Hubbard, who was drafted in the 3rd round, he's backing up Carlos Dunlap. Carlos Dunlap, contract year, so he's going to want to ball out. So they should, once again, have a really exceptional pass rush. But, again, linebacking core, that's going to drag them down a little bit. So that's another area of concern is we don't know about the health of the offensive line. We don't know really how good the linebacking core is going to be. Remember, Vontaze Burfict, he's, fun fact, according to Spotrac.com, or Spotrac.com, I think is how it's pronounced, the sports contract website. He's been fine. He's had over $4 million in fines in his career already, which really isn't shocking to anybody who watches the NFL. But at any rate, he's going to be suspended for the first part of the season. So, that's 4 games without him. So that's even less depth. And that really forces your hand there. So that's one less playmaker. They've got a lot of secondary talent. But even with the defensive backs, again, that linebacking core, I'm just not really sold on them. And that linebacking core could take a step back this year, and that could also lead to struggles against run defense. And then maybe the secondary doesn't have the impact that it had last year just because of that. So a lot of skepticism there. Cincinnati's another team that could easily win 9 or 10 games and get to the playoffs. But, again, they could also easily win 3. So Andy Dalton, I wouldn't be surprised if he has a big turnaround. But, again, not completely sold on that offensive line. Still haven't really fully recovered from the Mohamed Sanu and what's the other guy? Marvin Jones. They lose them in free agency a few years ago, and that put them in a kind of a big pickle, and they never fully recovered from that. So, yeah, Cincinnati, I think Pittsburgh's going to be really good again. Baltimore is going to be determined to get back to playoffs because they're really, really desperate, and Flacco's desperate, and John Harbaugh's desperate. And Cleveland has got to finally win some games, and some people think it could be a good deal of games. So I think even though, generally speaking, it feels like the division is not that great, for a team like Cincinnati, it feels like the division around them is kind of tough. So, we'll see. But I think there's a couple major holes there, and I think the whole Marvin Lewis effect, is finally the end of the road for him. We'll see with Dalton. So they'll go 6-10, finish third in the AFC North. And then finally the Browns. They've lost 50 of their last 54 games, 1-31 in 2 years under Hugh Jackson, who, ironically, obviously, used to be the Bengals offensive coordinator. A lot of people think with the offseason they had, they could go 6-10. I think the Vegas over-under is like 5.5 wins. 7-9, 8-8. Hell, some people say 9-7. And other people say, they might just win a game or two. I have them going 3-13, and the reason is, regardless of the reality show that is Hard Knocks, which is a great show, by the way, I've seen every episode over the years. Doesn't matter. I know you're like, who cares? But whatever. I can't really buy into the Hard Knocks hype. Have a lot of talent, but again, there's a lot of dysfunction. You can tell, even watching Hard Knocks, and again, reality show, but even watching Hard Knocks, you can just tell. Hugh has such a huge ego, and you can just tell him and Todd Haley are just, you can tell they're not really on the same page. They seem like they're already kind of clashing. Those are two big personalities. John Dorsey's a big personality. Greg Williams, defense coordinator, is a big personality. So you've got a lot of big personalities in charge, and it feels like something's got to give. And it just feels like, Hugh, yeah, he's a head coach, and he wants to be strong, he wants to make a statement, but just even the little bit watching on Hard Knocks, you're just like, this guy just doesn't know what the hell he's doing. Like, perfect example, Antonio Callaway, Florida receiver they drafted, I believe it was the 4th round. He gets in trouble. He gets arrested. Police found marijuana, which is really not that big of a deal, but they also found gun parts and what have you. And so what does Hugh Jackson do to punish Antonio Callaway? He comes right out and he even says this. Antonio Callaway played a majority of the preseason opener against the Giants, and Hugh said that was his punishment. It's like even Browns fans were all over him for that. And then you got to remember, a big part of them being successful offensively, and again, it feels like we just keep droning on and on about this every year, is Josh Gordon. And Josh Gordon voluntarily checked himself into rehab, and according to the NFL, he's not in trouble or nothing. And he just returned to practice. I believe it was over the weekend. And the thing is, he's missed, I think it's 43 of the last 48 games. So he's basically missed 3 whole years. Really wasn't that productive when he came back last year. And, you think about, I remember 2014 when he came back, he was kind of a little bit lethargic and out of shape. And you just wonder, what shape is he truly going to be in? Can he still play? Can he play at a high level, and he's going to keep himself out of trouble, be available for 16 games? One thing I'd be concerned about if I'm a Browns fan is his durability, because even beyond the conditioning, even if he trains real good, just the fact that he's missed so many games the last few years. So you really don't know what you're going to get out of him. Your depth, I like Rashard Higgins a lot. And then Jeff Janis is like an okay depth guy that came from Green Bay. And then, of course, Jarvis Landry, who they got from Miami in the offseason, and he's looked great in training camp. preseason, all that. He was terrific in Miami. So he's already building a great relationship with Tyrod Taylor and Baker Mayfield. But again, if you don't have Josh Gordon there, it just doesn't feel like this receiving core can be as dominant as it possibly could. Des Bryant just signed, but I just don't think Des Bryant's any good. He hasn't been good in a few years. He's going to drop a lot of passes. He's going to struggle to get open. And I know a lot of people say, well, part of that's Dak Prescott. But it's like, well, look at Cleveland's quarterbacks. I mean, you really can't say that Tyrod Taylor is any better than Dak Prescott. Tyrod's, a big reason why Buffalo got to the playoffs last year really wasn't because of Tyrod. And Tyrod has really good arm. He's a good athlete, but doesn't put up real great numbers as a quarterback. Dinks and dunks a lot. Doesn't see a lot of open receivers. And it was pointed out over and over again by Tony Romo on the CBS broadcast of the wild card game at Jacksonville. They should have won that game. So Tyrod's kind of limited. And, of course, they took Baker Mayfield number 1 overall, so Tyrod's not going to be there forever anyhow. But, it kind of feels like Baker Mayfield, he's like a more refined Tyrod Taylor. He's not the athlete that Taylor is. He's a better passer, but like Tyrod, it feels like he dinks and dunks too much. Did do some nice things against the Giants a couple weeks ago. Took a little bit of a step back the other night against the Bills in the preseason game, but that wasn't all on him. I'm not a big believer in Mayfield long term, and even if he's a pretty average, decent starter, I just feel like he's kind of limited. And I don't know how well he's really going to do as a rookie, regardless of what he does in preseason. I'm not sure how many games he's going to play, and I'm not sure how well he's going to do. But my biggest concern for him, even more so than Tyrod Taylor, listen, Tyrod's probably not going to be in Cleveland beyond this year, is we've seen so much dysfunction with Cleveland. We've seen, the coaching carousel and the GM carousel and all that. Everybody already feels like Hugh Jackson's going to get fired mid-season. Their bye week's pretty late. It's something like week 11 or somewhere around there. And I don't even think he's going to make it that far. I think 6 to 8 games, he'll be gone. It'll be kind of like a few years ago in Jacksonville when everybody was like, okay, Gus Bradley's getting fired. They bring him back the next year, and it's like, okay, well, he's probably going to get fired mid-season. Guess what happens? He gets fired mid-season. It was kind of a setback to Jacksonville at the time. They're doing fine now, but that was something that Jacksonville could have taken care of a little bit sooner and would have made things a little bit easier for them. But you look at the Browns. I do think Hugh's going to get fired mid-season. Todd Haley, his previous head coaching experience in Kansas City. Remember, he did lead him to the playoffs one time, even though he struggled some of the other years. I do think Todd Haley will become the interim head coach, and he'll coach out the rest of the year. And I do think that's when the Browns will really start winning games, is when Haley's in charge. But again, how many games is that going to be? Because, again, he's a guy who's also been a pretty hit-or-miss head coach, so he's really not a whole hell of a lot better than Hugh Jackson, to be completely honest with you, as a head coach. Coordinator's a different story, but head coach. So then you have to wonder, are those two guys going to clash? And then if it does happen where Hugh gets fired mid-season and then Haley takes over, that'll change things. So if you're a guy like Baker Mayfield, there's a good chance that they'll have another head coach, a new one, totally new regime to start 2019. If you're Baker Mayfield, there's a chance that by the start of your second NFL season, you could have 3 different head coaches and or 3 different offensive coordinators / quarterbacks coaches. Now, a big influence for John Dorsey drafting Baker Mayfield, and a guy that he tried to trade for in the offseason, was Alex Smith, who he had traded for when he was in Kansas City and had all that success, made all those playoff appearances. And like Mayfield, there's a lot of things, or like Smith, there's a lot of things I see in Mayfield's game where I'm like, he's kind of a dink and dunk quarterback. Arm strength is kind of hit or miss. Showed pretty good arm strength against Giants, but overall, struggles with tight windows. Dinks and dunks a lot. Won't turn it over, but he's not a particularly clutch quarterback. And, like Alex Smith early in his career, Alex Smith, he went through all these different coordinators and head coaches, and it took him a lot of years before he became a really good, consistent franchise-type quarterback. And I just fear for Baker Mayfield. I'm not a Browns fan, but I do for his sake that he's going to get kind of screwed on this coaching situation these first couple of years. So I think the smartest thing for Cleveland is to really ride it out with Tyrod as much as possible, especially if you have that coaching change midseason. Then maybe the last 4, 5, 6 games of the year you can insert Mayfield. I know what'll really happen is probably after 3 or 4 weeks Mayfield will start, might even start week 1. But I think realistically, if you wait until midseason or later, that would probably be the best time to go with Mayfield. But all in all, they've got a good-looking line. They lose Joe Thomas, but obviously, of course, Joel Bitonio's done a great job on the left side this training camp at left tackle. They drafted Austin Corbett, another Nevada guy in the second round. He's going to be left guard. Chris Hubbard, that I mentioned, a sign from the Steelers, was a good pick for them. David Njoku's back at tight end. We'll see if he can break out this season with a better quarterback situation. Nick Chubb was a heck of a pickup out of Georgia, really, really talented running back. And then bringing Carlos Hyde from the Niners. So, on paper, I mean, again, this is a team on paper. It looks like, yeah, they could win 5, 6, 7 games. But again, that stigma because it's Cleveland. And again, Hugh Jackson's so incompetent. We don't know how many games he's going to be the head coach into the season. You just wonder if maybe the offense is going to be underachieve. And even though they looked a lot better against Buffalo running the ball, they're terrible against the Giants. And remember, Buffalo wasn't particularly good stopping the run last year, so they're really not a great example anyway. So I am concerned because Hugh, with some of the decisions and some of the play calling, he hasn't really fully consistently committed to running the ball in the past. Better running backs this year, but I mean, Isaiah Crowell was a decent back. He wasn't terrible. And you still have Duke Johnson, who you have back again this year. And it just felt like Hugh doesn't like to consistently commit to running the football. He gets a little bit too pass happy. And I think when you have a guy like Tyrod Taylor, who's only going to throw the ball so many times a game, is kind of limited in that area, you really have to commit to running the football, because that's how Tyrod had success in Buffalo. Is even with some of the run defensive woes, the Bills' defense in general was pretty darn good. You had, at the time, a really great offense line. Obviously, Buffalo's line now is depleted, but at the time, he had a great offense line and a great running game, along with a great running back in Shady McCoy. So if Cleveland doesn't develop that running game, then, yeah, it will be Baker Mayfield sooner, much, much sooner than later, because Tyrod will be done pretty quickly because the offense will go nowhere, and then you'll have to see what Baker Mayfield can do, and we'll see if, without a running game. So I think a big part of my concern as far as only picking the Browns to go 3-13 and finish last in the AFC North is they have to prove that they can actually win some games, obviously. But again, even with the talent on offense, I'm not sure about the quarterbacks, and I'm not sure about the running game. I'm not sure how consistently good the run blocking is going to be. I'm not sure how consistent Hugh Jackson company is going to commit to running the ball, because remember, Todd Haley, even at Pittsburgh, all the talent, all the success, there were a lot of times, especially in big games, where his play calling was questionable, and there were a lot of times where he got pretty pass happy himself. He really loved to abuse kind of throwing the football a little bit too much, even when the running game was looking good. So that's a concern, is are the Browns going to consistently commit to running the ball? What kind of success are they going to have this year running the ball? And then, Josh Gordon, even with him returning, his status is up in the air. Like I said, I don't think Des Bryant's really going to do anything at all for them. And then defensively, even though they, in a lot of ways, played a lot better than their defensive rankings being towards the bottom of the league because they had all the turnovers from the offense, you still got a lot of questions there. You got some good-looking linebackers, obviously Jamie Collins, but he missed a ton of games due to injury last year. You got Joe Schobert. And then obviously Myles Garrett, number 1 overall pick a couple years back. He wasn't even healthy all of last year, and he still had like 7 sacks in 9 or 10 games or 11 games or something. He could be one of the league leaders in sacks this year. Emmanuel Ogbah, he's making a lot of improvement, but again, doesn't have the sack totals yet. I think he had 4 last year. Carl Nassib, who's a key backup, when he's not giving financial advice on Hard Knocks, he's a solid player, but again, is off the bench rotational guy, is only going to give you so much in the way of a pass rush. Cleveland for a number of years hasn't had a real great pass rush. Their sack totals have been way down there. So again, I'm not really sure beyond Myles Garrett who else is really going to step up and get those sacks, and that's the thing that kind of concerns me. Secondary-wise, I still thought they should have drafted Bradley Chubb, the NC State defensive end, with the 4th pick. And instead they took Denzel Ward, the corner out of Ohio State. Ohio State, they have produced a lot of good cornerbacks, especially in recent years, but still, he's a bit undersized, and he's had some ups and downs so far from what I've heard with camp and kind of leading into camp. So we'll see what happens with him, but he's a guy who's probably going to be playing a lot early on. Jabril Peppers, I thought was a really, really bad pick as a first rounder out of Michigan a couple years back, and he showed it last year that he's very, very limited in what he can do. So this is a big year for him, and we'll see if he can step it up. But overall, I'm got a lot of skepticism about that secondary. There's a lot of youth there. Linebacking core is really good, but again, where's the pass rush going to be? Because that'll decide how good the secondary could be. They're going to grow and they're going to get a little bit better. But again, if there's no pass rush there, that's going to put a lot more pressure on them. So one thing that's really going to help Cleveland, it's kind of the reverse of Kansas City. Kansas City, their defense is going to have to get used to a lot more turnovers from the offense with Pat Mahomes taking over for Alex Smith. We're already seeing it now in the preseason, and Kansas City's defense is on the decline as is. Cleveland's going to be in a position now where presumably Tyrod Taylor will continue to protect the ball. Baker Mayfield, like he did in college, will presumably not turn over too much in the NFL. That'll help the defense because the field position and all that stuff could be a lot better. Maybe the time of possession won't be as lopsided. But again, I'm not sure, if the Browns are going to consistently have that pass rush, and that's going to be a huge setback for their defense, and that could be the difference between them being a top 10 type defense or maybe just a top 15 or 20 defense. You still have to worry about the scoring defense aspect of it and the secondary and some of their woes. And then again, we don't know, are they going to have a pretty good running game or are they going to be a bottom feeder? We've seen night and day in 2 preseason games, but I'm just not sure if we're going to see more of what they did in Buffalo in that preseason game, or if we're going to see more of the Giants. In recent years under Hugh Jackson, they've looked more like they did in that first preseason game against the Giants, where there was just nowhere to run. And so no matter how talented your running backs are, if there's no holes, you can't do anything about that. So Cleveland could easily, definitely go way beyond my expectations and win the 6 games. A lot of people think they'll win 6-10, but I'm going to go 3-13. A team that's just trying to win games. Remember that first year after Detroit went 0-16, they draft Matthew Stafford number 1 overall. He's supposed to be the savior, just like Mayfield here in Cleveland. But the thing about it is, Detroit still went 2-14 that very next year, and then I think the year after they went like 6-10, and then they made the playoffs after that. So especially if Hugh Jackson's going to get fired mid-season, there's a good chance that Cleveland might only have like 1 win by the time he gets fired, if that. They might still be winless. So they could really surge second half of the year, but I just don't really think that they're going to have these 6, 7, 8, 9 wins that a lot of people think they're going to have. I think 3-13 is more realistic, but that's a good start because that at least kind of pushes them in the right direction. So anyways, I know I went a little bit long on this video, but go to sugarhuddle.com as always. Subscribe to my videos on YouTube. More content up soon. But yeah, that's all I got. So yeah, take care.